The world Kofi Mensah had built was nothing short of extraordinary. At just 36, he was a household name in Accra, the kind of man others aspired to be, charming, successful, and seemingly invincible. Kofi's life was a tapestry of hard work and ambition, and he wore his achievements like a crown. Whether he was closing deals in his corner office or attending glamorous events with his wife Linda on his arm, everything about his life spoke of triumph. That morning, the sun shone brightly, casting a golden hue over the streets as Kofi sped through the city in his sleek black car. His thoughts were consumed with his next business meeting, a deal he was confident would further cement his legacy. Linda had kissed him goodbye earlier, her lips brushing his cheek in a hurried yet affectionate gesture. "Don't forget, we have dinner with the Akablas tonight," she had reminded him. The crash happened in the blink of an eye. A rogue truck barreled through a red light, its driver distracted by a phone call. Kofi barely had time to react. The screech of tires, the violent crunch of metal against metal, and then a deafening silence. When Kofi regained consciousness, the sterile white walls of a hospital room greeted him. Pain coursed through his body, sharp and unrelenting. He tried to move his legs, but they remained lifeless beneath the crisp hospital sheets. Panic set in. A flood of medical terms followed as doctors explained the extent of his injuries. Paralysis, waist down, life-altering. The words blurred together, their weight sinking into his chest like a stone. Linda arrived shortly after, her face a mixture of shock and forced composure. She held his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "We'll get through this, Kofi," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're strong. You always have been." For a moment, Kofi believed her. The days that followed were grueling. Physical therapy sessions were introduced, each one a reminder of how much his life had changed. Nurses came and went, their polite smiles masking pity. Kofi hated the feeling of helplessness that enveloped him. Yet, what hurt the most was seeing Linda's gradual withdrawal. Initially, she was attentive, sitting by his bedside for hours, engaging him in light conversation to lift his spirits. But as the weeks dragged on, her visits became shorter, her demeanor more strained. She began to spend long hours away, always armed with excuses. "I'm handling things at home," she would say. "You don't need to worry about anything." One evening, Linda arrived at the hospital with a man Kofi didn't recognize. "This is Daniel," she introduced him. Her tone far too casual. "He's a friend. He's been helping me out while I juggle everything." Daniel was tall and confident, his handshake firm as he greeted Kofi. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," he said, his tone respectful but warm. Yet something about his presence unsettled Kofi. As the two of them spoke in hushed tones near the door, Kofi noticed a lightness in Linda's laughter he hadn't heard in weeks. That night, as he lay in the darkened hospital room, the nagging sense of unease refused to leave him. He replayed the evening in his mind. The way Linda had leaned ever so slightly toward Daniel, the way her eyes sparkled when he spoke. It wasn't just gratitude in her gaze. It was something deeper, something that made Kofi's stomach churn. The days that followed only deepened his suspicions. Linda's visits grew even more sporadic, her excuses flimsy and hurried. She seemed preoccupied, her once bright smile now faint and forced. Kofi found himself longing for her presence, even as he dreaded the growing chasm between them. One afternoon, while a nurse adjusted his wheelchair, Kofi glanced at his reflection in the hospital window. The man staring back at him was a shadow of who he had been, his once broad shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He barely recognized himself. Linda's growing distance gnawed at him. But what could he do? He was trapped, both physically and emotionally. His mind screamed for answers, but his body offered no escape. The final straw came a week later, when Linda visited with Daniel once more. This time, they sat together on the couch, talking animatedly while Kofi watched from his bed. His heart sank as he realized the truth. Linda was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Kofi had faced many challenges in life, but none had prepared him for this. The man who had built an empire was now fighting to hold on to the one person he thought would always stand by his side. The cracks in his perfect life were no longer subtle, they were gaping chasms, threatening to swallow him whole. The hum of voices filled the hospital room as Kofi's parents stood at his bedside, their presence a beacon of warmth amidst his cold reality. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, cupped his face in her hands, her eyes brimming with both sorrow and determination. "Kofi," she whispered, "you are my son. You've faced challenges before, and you will overcome this one too. You are not alone." His father stood beside her, silent but resolute, his hand resting on Kofi's shoulder. "We are proud of you, son. No matter what happens, we are here for you." For a fleeting moment, Kofi felt grounded, their love wrapping around him like a protective shield. The familiar scent of his mother's perfume and the gentle squeeze of his father's hand reminded him of who he was, a man of strength, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Linda, ever the dutiful wife in their presence, played her role flawlessly. She fussed over Kofi, adjusting his pillows and asking the nurse for water. She laughed lightly at his father's jokes and held his hand as if she'd never let go. But the moment his parents left, her demeanor shifted. The warmth in her eyes faded, replaced by a cool detachment that left Kofi reeling. Later that evening, as Kofi lay staring at the sterile white ceiling of his hospital room, he heard the faint sound of laughter drifting from the hallway. He turned his head toward the door, his pulse quickening. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until Linda's familiar voice reached his ears. "You're impossible," she said, her tone light and teasing, a giggle escaping her lips. It was a sound Kofi hadn't heard in weeks, but the way she spoke, soft, flirtatious, was not for him. His chest tightened, the laughter slicing through him like a blade. Who was she talking to, he wondered, his mind racing. A nurse? A friend? Or someone else? The next morning, Linda arrived late, her excuse vague and unconvincing. "I had some errands to run," she said, waving off his concern. She barely stayed 15 minutes before checking her phone and excusing herself. Each passing day only deepened Kofi's suspicions, her absences leaving him feeling abandoned during the moments he needed her most. One day, as Kofi wheeled himself through the hospital corridor during his physical therapy session, he caught a glimpse of Linda standing near the exit, her back to him. She was on the phone, her voice low and conspiratorial. He strained to hear, catching fragments of her conversation. "I can't wait to see you," she said, her tone filled with warmth and excitement. "No, not tonight. It'll be too obvious." A knot formed in Kofi's stomach. Her words confirmed what his heart had been dreading. Linda's loyalty, once unwavering, was slipping away. But what could he do? He felt powerless, his paralysis not just physical but emotional. After weeks of grueling therapy, the day of Kofi's discharge finally arrived. He had imagined Linda's arrival would be marked by fanfare, a warm embrace, and words of encouragement. Instead, Daniel arrived, his polished demeanor and confident smile a poor substitute for the woman Kofi had married. "Linda asked me to pick you up," Daniel explained as he helped Kofi into the car. "She's stuck in a business meeting." The words stung. Kofi said nothing, biting back the bitterness that threatened to spill out. The ride home was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Kofi's mind raced with thoughts of Linda, why she hadn't come, what she was really doing, and why Daniel seemed so comfortable in her absence. When they arrived home, the house felt different. It wasn't just the physical adjustments made for his condition, the ramps, the rearranged furniture, but the atmosphere. The warmth that had once filled their home was gone, replaced by a coldness that mirrored Linda's growing distance. As Daniel wheeled Kofi into the living room, Linda appeared at the doorway, her face lighting up with what Kofi could only describe as feigned enthusiasm. "Welcome home, darling," she said, leaning in to plant a perfunctory kiss on his forehead. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Kofi's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where a pair of men's shoes sat neatly beside the couch. They weren't his. His heart sank as he looked back at Linda, her expression unreadable. Subtle changes caught his attention. A misplaced vase, a jacket slung over the back of a chair that didn't belong to him. That evening, as he sat alone in the living room, he replayed the day's events in his mind. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture they formed was one of betrayal. Linda's laughter, her absences, Daniel's increasing presence, it all pointed to a truth Kofi wasn't ready to face. The man who had built an empire was now reduced to a silent observer in his own life, watching helplessly as the woman he loved slipped further away. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the ceiling fan in the corner of the living room. Kofi sat in his wheelchair, staring at the framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was from his wedding day. Linda, in a flowing white dress, her eyes bright with joy as Kofi, beaming with pride, slipped a gold ring onto her finger. It felt like a lifetime ago, a memory belonging to someone else. The muffled sound of laughter broke through his thoughts, jolting him back to the present. He turned his chair slightly toward the hallway, the source of the noise. Linda's laugh rang out, light and carefree, followed by a deeper chuckle that Kofi instantly recognized as Daniel's. His hands clenched the armrests of his wheelchair, his jaw tightening as he strained to hear the conversation. Peering toward the dining room, Kofi caught a glimpse of them through the half-open door. Linda was seated at the table, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm as they leaned in close, their voices too low for him to make out the words. Her face, which had been cold and distant toward Kofi for weeks, was now animated, her smile radiant. The sight pierced Kofi like a dagger. He had always thought betrayal would come with shouting matches and slammed doors, but this quiet, casual intimacy was somehow worse. His heart ached as he watched the woman he loved share a moment that should have been his with another man. Unable to endure the scene any longer, Kofi wheeled himself out of the house and onto the garden path. The cool evening air brushed against his face, but it did little to soothe the storm raging inside him. He stopped near the hibiscus bushes, his shoulders slumping as tears welled in his eyes. He felt helpless, trapped in his own body, his own home, and his own despair. "Sir, are you okay?" The voice was soft but firm, and Kofi turned to see Akua standing a few steps away. She was holding a small watering can, her apron streaked with soil from the garden she had been tending. Her wide, dark eyes studied him with a mix of concern and hesitation, as if she wasn't sure whether to approach. Kofi quickly wiped at his face, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable moment. "I'm fine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Akua didn't move. "You don't look fine," she said gently. She set the watering can down and stepped closer. "Would you like me to take you for a walk around the garden? The fresh air might help." For a moment, Kofi considered refusing. But there was something about Akua's quiet demeanor, the way she looked at him without pity, that made him nod. "All right," he murmured. Akua moved behind his wheelchair and began to push him along the stone path, pointing out the flowers that had bloomed since his last time outside. She spoke in soft tones, describing how she had replanted the lilies and trimmed the overgrown hedges. Her words were simple, but they carried a calmness that began to ease Kofi's racing thoughts. "You're good at this," Kofi said after a while. "At gardening?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "At knowing what people need," he clarified. Akua smiled faintly but didn't reply. They continued in silence for a while longer before she spoke again. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but I see how things are in the house, and I just want you to know that you don't deserve this. No one does." Kofi's throat tightened, but he said nothing. The next day, Kofi overheard a heated conversation in the kitchen. As he wheeled himself closer, he recognized the voices. It was Akua and Linda. "Why are you doing this to him?" Akua demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "He's your husband. He needs you." "You need to mind your place," Linda snapped, her tone icy. "This is none of your business, and if you keep pushing, you'll find yourself out of a job." Kofi froze, his heart aching at the words. Akua was defending him, putting herself at risk, while Linda showed nothing but contempt. That evening, as Akua helped him to his room, Kofi finally spoke. "I heard what you said to Linda," he said quietly. Akua looked startled but didn't deny it. "I'm sorry? Sir, I know it wasn't my place." "No," Kofi interrupted. "Thank you." Akua paused, her expression softening. "You don't have to thank me. I hate seeing you like this. You deserve better." Her words stayed with Kofi long after she left the room. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile lifeline tethering him to the idea that he wasn't entirely alone. The sun poured through the large bay windows of Kofi's living room, but the warmth it offered didn't reach him. Instead, he sat in his wheelchair near the corner, a silent witness to his own humiliation. Across the room, Linda was seated on the couch, her laughter echoing through the space as Daniel Akua poured her a glass of wine. Their ease with each other was infuriating, intimate, casual, and devoid of any attempt to hide their growing connection. Kofi's fists clenched around the armrests of his wheelchair. "Linda," he called, his voice strained but firm. "Can I speak with you for a moment? Alone." Linda barely glanced in his direction, her smile faltering for a split second before returning to full brightness. "Anything you want to say to me, you can say here," she replied dismissively, taking a sip of her wine. Daniel stood awkwardly, clearly caught in the tension of the moment. "Maybe I should step out?" he offered, but Linda shook her head, resting a hand on his arm. "There's no need," she said, her tone icy. "Kofi, you don't need to make a scene." "A scene?" Kofi's voice wavered with both anger and disbelief. "I'm your husband, and you're sitting there with..." "With what?" Linda interrupted, her voice rising as she leaned forward. "With a friend who's actually helping me cope with everything, while I'm stuck taking care of a man who's nothing like the Kofi I married?" The words hit Kofi like a physical blow. His chest tightened, and he felt the sting of tears threatening to spill. He bit down on his lower lip, refusing to cry in front of them. "If that's how you feel," he said quietly, "then why are you still here?" Linda laughed bitterly. "You think it's that simple? If I leave, I lose everything. The house, the money, the respect I've worked so hard to build alongside you. No, Kofi, I'll stay, but don't expect me to be the doting wife you seem to think you deserve." With that, she turned her attention back to Daniel, effectively dismissing her husband. Kofi sat frozen in his chair, humiliation burning through him. The sound of their laughter returned, cutting through him like a knife. Later that evening, Akua found Kofi in the garden, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped in defeat. She approached quietly, a tray of tea in her hands. "Sir," she said gently, setting the tray on the small table beside him, "you haven't eaten all day. You need to take something." Kofi didn't respond at first. He stared at the ground, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, shame, and despair. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Why are you still here, Akua? Why haven't you left like everyone else?" Akua hesitated before sitting on the bench beside him. "Because I believe you're worth staying for," she said simply. Her words were unembellished, but the sincerity in her tone brought a lump to Kofi's throat. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any hint of pity. Instead, he saw something far deeper: kindness, resilience, and a quiet strength that seemed to anchor him even in his darkest moments. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. The days that followed were no easier. Linda's behavior became more brazen, and Daniel's presence in the house more frequent. One afternoon, Kofi wheeled himself into the living room, only to find Linda and Daniel curled up on the couch, sharing a bottle of wine. The sight made his stomach churn, but he said nothing, his silence a shield against the humiliation. Later that night, Linda confronted him in the hallway, her arms crossed and her expression smug. "Why don't you just give me the divorce, Kofi?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's not like you have anything left to offer." Kofi met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a quiet determination she hadn't seen before. "Because I won't let you win that easily," he said. "This is still my home, Linda. And no matter how much you try to push me out, I won't go without a fight." The exchange left Linda fuming, but it also sparked a shift in Kofi. He began spending more time with Akua, who continued to encourage him to focus on his recovery. She took over his care almost entirely, helping him with tasks that initially left him embarrassed, like bathing and dressing. Each small act of kindness chipped away at the wall of shame Kofi had built around himself. One morning, as Akua helped him through his therapy exercises, Kofi let out a frustrated sigh. "I'm tired of being this dependent," he said, his voice laced with frustration. Akua knelt beside him, her expression calm but firm. "You're not just your body, sir," she said. "You're more than this chair, and you'll prove that, not to Linda, not to anyone else, but to yourself." Her words stayed with Kofi long after the session ended. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of something he thought he had lost forever: hope. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of hibiscus from the garden as Kofi sat in his wheelchair on the front porch. Akua had insisted he get some fresh air after a particularly rough night, and now, as the sunlight bathed the yard, he found a rare moment of solace. Yet his peace was short-lived. Inside the house, the sound of Linda's sharp voice shattered the quiet. "Kofi," Linda called out, her tone cold and commanding. "Daniel is staying over tonight. I need you to move to the guest room." The word struck him like a slap. Kofi turned his chair toward the open door, his voice trembling as he responded, "This is my home, Linda. My room. You can't just—" "I can and I will," Linda interrupted, appearing in the doorway. Her arms were crossed and a smirk played on her lips. "You think you have a say in this? You're lucky I haven't thrown you out entirely." Akua, who had been trimming the rose bushes nearby, froze. Her hands tightened around the pruning shears, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. Linda didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the house, leaving Kofi to sit in stunned silence. He felt a hand on his shoulder moments later and looked up to see Akua standing beside him, her expression soft but resolute. "Come," she said quietly. "Let's take a walk." As Akua pushed his wheelchair down the garden path, the weight of Linda's words settled heavily on Kofi's chest. "Why are you helping me?" he asked finally, his voice low. "You see how pathetic I've become. Why don't you just leave like everyone else?" Akua stopped the chair and moved to stand in front of him, her dark eyes locking onto his. "You're not pathetic, Mr. Mensah," she said firmly. "You're hurting. There's a difference." She hesitated, then added, "Do you know why I took this job? It wasn't just for the money. I saw the way you treated people, your kindness, your respect. Even now, when most people would lash out, you're still holding on to your dignity. That's not pathetic. That's strength." Kofi looked away, the sting of tears pricking his eyes. "I don't feel strong," he admitted. "I feel broken." Akua knelt down beside his chair, her voice softening. "When I was 15, my family was everything to me," she began. "We weren't rich, but we were happy. Then, the accident happened. A car crash. My mother died instantly, and my father was paralyzed. He lived for 7 more years, but in pain. All the money we had went to his medical bills. By the time he passed, I was alone, with nothing." Kofi's gaze snapped back to her, surprise flickering in his eyes. Akua's voice wavered slightly, but she continued. "I wanted to give up. I even thought about ending it all. But something inside me refused to let go. I decided I would rebuild, no matter how long it took." She placed a hand gently on his arm. "That's why I'm here. Because I know what it's like to feel like your world is crumbling around you. And I know that with the right people beside you, you can rebuild." For the first time in weeks, Kofi felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost entirely. Hope. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you keep going?" Akua smiled faintly. "One step at a time, and sometimes with help." Later that afternoon, Akua introduced Kofi to a physical therapist she had contacted on his behalf. The man was young and full of energy, his optimism infectious. "I've seen cases worse than yours," the therapist said confidently. "It'll take time and effort, but we can get you back on your feet, literally." Kofi was skeptical at first, but Akua's encouraging nod gave him the push he needed to agree to the sessions. The first one was grueling, every movement a reminder of how far he had to go. But when the session ended, Kofi felt a small, unfamiliar spark within him. Pride. As the days turned into weeks, Kofi began to see small improvements. He could shift his weight more easily, his arms growing stronger as he adjusted to his new reality. Each victory, no matter how minor, was celebrated quietly by Akua, who remained his constant source of support. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kofi sat with Akua on the porch. He turned to her, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "I don't think I'd still be here if it weren't for you." Akua looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You would have found your way," she said softly. "You're stronger than you think, Mr. Mensah. You just needed a reminder." For the first time in months, Kofi allowed himself to smile, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, the road ahead didn't seem so daunting. The dining room echoed with the faint clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation. From his wheelchair in the adjoining living room, Kofi could hear Linda's voice, her laughter laced with the kind of warmth she hadn't shown him in months. Sitting across from her at the table, Daniel leaned forward, a sly smile spreading across his face as they whispered to one another. Kofi clenched his fists, the sight and sound of their blatant intimacy making his blood boil. It wasn't the first time he had witnessed them like this, but tonight, something inside him snapped. The audacity of it all, the laughter, the closeness, The way Linda no longer cared to hide her betrayal was too much to bear. Summoning every ounce of strength he had, Kofi wheeled himself into the dining room, his expression a mask of quiet fury. The room fell silent as Linda and Daniel looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. "Linda," Kofi began, his voice steady but cold, "I need to speak with you. Now." Linda arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a mocking smile. "Oh, Kofi," she said lightly, setting down her glass of wine. "Can it wait? Daniel and I are in the middle of dinner." "No," Kofi said firmly, his tone cutting through her false cheer. "It can't." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking between Kofi and Linda. "Maybe I should." "Stay," Linda interrupted, her eyes locked on Kofi's. "If he has something to say, he can say it in front of you." Kofi's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I've tried to ignore it, to give you the benefit of the doubt, but I'm done pretending I don't see what's right in front of me." He turned his gaze to Daniel, his voice sharpening. "I know what's going on between the two of you." Linda let out a laugh, the sound harsh and biting. "Oh, Kofi, don't be ridiculous. You're imagining things." "Am I?" Kofi shot back, his eyes narrowing. "Do you really think I haven't noticed the way you've been acting? The late nights, the excuses, the way you look at him?" Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Linda silenced him with a wave of her hand. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "And what if you're right?" she challenged, her tone defiant. "What are you going to do about it? You can't even stand Kofi. You can't even fight for yourself." The words hung in the air, cruel and cutting. Kofi's chest tightened, the weight of her betrayal threatening to crush him. But before he could respond, Akua stepped into the room, her expression fierce. "That's enough," Akua said, her voice trembling with anger. She stood between Kofi and Linda, her small frame radiating strength. "How can you speak to him like that? After everything he's done for you?" Linda scoffed, rising from her chair. "Stay out of this, Akua," she snapped. "This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Akua shot back, her voice rising. "Because unlike you, I actually care about him. I see the pain you put him through every day. And for what? To flaunt your affair in front of him like he's nothing?" Linda's face twisted with rage, but she said nothing. Daniel, sensing the tension, stood abruptly. "I think I should go," he muttered, heading for the door. As the sound of Daniel's retreating footsteps faded, Linda turned back to Akua, her eyes blazing. "You're fired," she spat. "Pack your things and leave." Akua didn't flinch. "If that's what it takes to protect him, then fine, but I'm not going anywhere until he's safe." Kofi, who had been silent during the exchange, finally spoke. "No one's going anywhere," he said quietly but firmly. He looked up at Linda, his expression one of quiet determination. "I'm done letting you humiliate me. If you want this life so badly, you can have it. But you won't take my dignity with you." Linda stared at him, stunned into silence. For the first time, Kofi saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, as if she realized she had pushed him too far. That night, Akua helped Kofi back to his room, her movements gentle and precise. As she settled him into bed, Kofi turned to her, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly, "for standing up for me." Akua smiled faintly. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Mensah. You deserve to be treated with respect. Don't ever forget that." As the door closed behind her, Kofi stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do. Linda's defiance had left him no choice. It was time to take back control of his life, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The morning light filtered through the curtains of Kofi's room, casting soft golden patterns on the floor. He sat in his wheelchair near the window, staring out at the garden. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls echoing with the ghosts of betrayal and humiliation. Linda had made her stance clear. Her mockery, her defiance, and her blatant disregard for his feelings left no room for reconciliation. But last night had been a turning point. Akua's unwavering loyalty and her bold confrontation with Linda had stirred something deep within him. For the first time in months, Kofi felt a glimmer of strength. He could no longer allow Linda to dictate his life. He had to take action. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock of Akua at the door. She stepped in quietly, carrying a tray with his breakfast. "Good morning, Mr. Mensah," she said, her tone warm but cautious. She set the tray on the table beside him and began arranging the items. "How are you feeling today?" Kofi gave her a faint smile. Better, he admitted. And I've made a decision. Akua looked at him curiously but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I need to leave this house, Kofi said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. I can't stay here any longer, Akua. Not with Linda. Not like this. Akua nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Where will you go? Kofi hesitated. I'll ask my parents if I can stay at the countryside house. It's quiet there, away from all of this. I need space to heal, to figure out what comes next. A flicker of relief crossed Akua's face. I think that's a good idea, she said. You deserve peace. Kofi glanced at her, his brow furrowing. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but would you come with me? I don't think I can do this alone. Akua's eyes widened slightly, but then she smiled. Of course, she said softly. I promised to stay by your side, and I meant it. Later that day, Kofi called his parents. His father answered, his deep voice filled with concern. Kofi, what's wrong? I need your help, Kofi said simply. He explained the situation, the tension in the house, and his decision to leave. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then his father spoke. Come to the countryside house, he said firmly. It's yours. We'll handle everything. Relief washed over Kofi, but it was tinged with sadness. Admitting his failure, his inability to save his marriage, felt like a personal defeat. But deep down, he knew this was the right choice. The next few days were a flurry of quiet preparation. Akua packed Kofi's belongings, carefully avoiding Linda's watchful eyes. Linda, for her part, remained aloof, her attention focused on her own affairs. When the day of departure finally arrived, Linda didn't even bother to say goodbye. As Kofi and Akua drove away from the house in a modest van packed with their belongings, Kofi couldn't help but glance back. The house that had once symbolized his success now felt like a monument to everything he had lost. He turned his gaze forward, the road stretching out before them, a promise of new beginnings. The countryside house was a stark contrast to the modern luxury of their city home. Surrounded by lush greenery and rolling hills, it exuded a sense of tranquility Kofi hadn't felt in months. As Akua helped him settle into the cozy living room, he took a deep breath, savoring the quiet. Over the next few weeks, Kofi began to adjust to his new life. Akua continued to support him, not just physically, but emotionally. Her presence was a steady anchor, her quiet strength inspiring him to push forward. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Kofi turned to Akua. You've given up so much to help me, he said. Why? Akua glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. Because I see the man you are, not the man Linda tried to make you believe you were, she said simply. You have so much more to give, Kofi. I believe in you. Her words stayed with him long after she retired for the night. For the first time in a long while, Kofi felt a spark of hope, not just for recovery, but for a future beyond the pain. A week later, Kofi received an invitation to a family gathering. His parents were hosting a small event to celebrate their wedding anniversary and insisted that he attend. At first, Kofi hesitated. The thought of facing his extended family, of answering their probing questions about his marriage and condition, filled him with dread. But Akua encouraged him. This is a chance to show them that you're still here, still strong, she said. You don't have to face it alone. On the day of the event, Akua dressed Kofi in a sharp navy suit, her meticulous care evident in every detail. When they arrived, the whispers began almost immediately. Relatives exchanged glances, their eyes flickering between Kofi and Akua. Who's she? One cousin whispered. A maid, another speculated. But Kofi ignored them. As the evening progressed, he found himself leaning on Akua's quiet presence, her encouragement helping him navigate the stares and questions. For the first time, he felt more than just a shadow of his former self. He felt seen, not as a man broken by circumstance, but as someone finding his way back to strength. As the night drew to a close, Kofi looked at Akua, a small smile playing on his lips. Thank you, he said softly. For what? She asked, tilting her head. For reminding me who I am. Akua smiled back, her eyes shining with quiet pride. You've always known, she said. You just needed someone to remind you. And for the first time in months, Kofi felt like he was truly starting over. The countryside air was crisp and invigorating, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. Kofi sat on the porch of his parents' countryside house, his wheelchair parked near the railing as he gazed at the rolling hills that stretched beyond the horizon. The serenity of the landscape offered a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind in the city. For the first time in months, he felt a sliver of peace, though it was still tinged with an ache he couldn't quite shake. Akua appeared at the doorway, a tray in her hands. She carried a pot of tea and 2 cups, her movements careful and deliberate. "You seem deep in thought," she said softly as she set the tray down on the small table beside him. "I thought tea might help." Kofi glanced up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You always seem to know what I need before I even ask," he said. Akua shrugged modestly as she poured the tea. "It's not hard to read someone when you care," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the warm tea warding off the chill of the early evening. Kofi found himself stealing glances at Akua, noting the way her hair caught the fading light and the calm determination that always seemed to radiate from her. He had grown used to her presence over the past weeks, but now he felt something deeper stirring within him, something he hadn't expected. "Akua," he began hesitantly, "do you ever think about what life could have been like? If things had gone differently?" Akua looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I've learned not to dwell on what could have been. It's what we do with what we have that matters." Her words struck a chord with Kofi. He nodded slowly, taking another sip of his tea. "I admire that about you," he said after a pause. "Your strength, your ability to keep moving forward, no matter what." Akua's cheeks flushed slightly, but she smiled. "It's not always easy," she said, "but helping you, it's given me purpose again." Later that week, during one of Kofi's physical therapy sessions, something extraordinary happened. The therapist had been encouraging Kofi to bear weight on his legs, a grueling task that had thus far resulted in little progress. Akua stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly as she watched. "Let's try one more time," the therapist said, his tone firm but encouraging. "I'll support you, but I want you to focus on pushing up." Kofi gritted his teeth, his muscles trembling as he braced his arms on the handles of his chair. He could feel the strain in his legs, the dull ache of effort where there had been nothing but numbness for months. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to rise. It was only for a few seconds, but it was enough. Akua let out a gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. "You did it!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with awe. Kofi collapsed back into the chair, his chest heaving with exertion. A shaky laugh escaped him as he looked up at Akua. "I stood," he said, the disbelief in his voice giving way to pride. "I actually stood." Akua knelt beside him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I told you you could do it," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the shared triumph, creating a connection that neither could ignore. Kofi reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against Akua's. She didn't pull away. That evening, as they sat on the porch once again, the weight of the moment lingered between them. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Kofi finally decided to break the silence. "Akua," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know when it happened, but I think I've started to feel something for you, something more than gratitude." Akua's eyes widened slightly, and she looked away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Mr. Mensah?" she began, but Kofi interrupted her. "Please, call me Kofi," he said. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has. You've seen me at my lowest and never once turned away. I don't know what I'd do without you." Akua took a deep breath, her hands stilling. When she looked back at him, there was a mixture of hesitation and something else, something tender in her gaze. "Kofi," she said softly, "I've spent so long trying to keep my heart closed. I didn't think I could feel this way again. But being with you has changed that." Kofi's heart swelled at her words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to hope, not just for his recovery, but for a future filled with love and meaning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they sat side by side, their hands brushing against each other. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a new beginning. The countryside house had taken on a new energy in the weeks following Kofi's breakthrough. The once somber and quiet dwelling now buzzed with life, laughter, and progress. Kofi's daily routine was rigorous yet rewarding, filled with physical therapy sessions, morning stretches in the garden, and long talks with Akua in the evenings. Each day brought small victories, lifting his legs higher during therapy, sitting more upright, and even managing a few steps with assistance. Akua was his constant support. Whether she was cheering him on during therapy or encouraging him to keep pushing through the difficult moments, her presence was unwavering. Kofi couldn't help but marvel at her resilience and warmth, traits that had become a beacon of light in his life. One morning, as they sat in the garden beneath the shade of a large baobab tree, Kofi set his tea aside and turned to Akua. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone contemplative, "about what comes next." Akua tilted her head, curiosity lighting her features. "What do you mean?" "For so long, my life revolved around my business, my marriage, and, well, myself," Kofi admitted. "But after everything that's happened, I realize I've been given a second chance, not just to rebuild my life, but to help others do the same." Akua's eyes softened as she listened. "That's a noble thought, Kofi. What are you thinking of doing?" "I want to start a foundation," he said, the idea taking shape even as he spoke. "Something that supports people with disabilities, helps them access therapy, equipment, and resources they need to reclaim their lives. There are so many people who don't have the opportunities I've been given. I want to change that." Akua's face broke into a smile, her pride evident. "That's a beautiful idea," she said, "and I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Kofi's phone buzzing on the table. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the message. It was from one of his former business associates, forwarding a link to an article. The headline made his stomach drop. "Socialite Linda Mensa spotted in public with business tycoon Daniel Akua, rumors of scandal swirl." Kofi's hands trembled slightly as he read the article. It detailed Linda's extravagant spending, lavish parties, and her highly publicized relationship with Daniel. But the twist came toward the end. Daniel was married, with a wife and children in another city. The revelation had sent shockwaves through social circles, tarnishing both Linda and Daniel's reputations. Akua, noticing the tension in Kofi's expression, leaned closer. "What is it?" she asked gently. Kofi handed her the phone, letting her read the article. When she finished, her brow furrowed in concern. "She's falling apart," Akua murmured. Kofi nodded. "And yet part of me feels nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just emptiness." "You've grown beyond her," Akua said simply. "Linda was a part of your past, but she doesn't define your future. You're on a different path now, one that she can't touch." The words resonated deeply with Kofi. For so long, he had allowed Linda's betrayal to weigh him down, to shape his sense of worth. But now, sitting beside Akua in the tranquility of the countryside, he realized she was right. Linda no longer had power over him. That evening, Kofi took his first unassisted steps in the living room. Akua and the therapist stood nearby, watching with bated breath as he gripped the back of a chair and pushed himself forward. One step, then another. The room erupted in cheers as he finally sat back down, his face flushed with exertion but lit with triumph. "You're incredible," Akua said, her voice thick with emotion. "No," Kofi replied, looking at her with a soft smile. "We're incredible. I couldn't have done this without you." The bond between them deepened with each passing day, and soon it was impossible to ignore the way Kofi's feelings for Akua had grown. He found himself drawn to her not just for her kindness and support, but for the quiet strength that had carried them both through the hardest times. One afternoon, as they worked on plans for the foundation, Kofi set his pen down and looked at Akua intently. "You know," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration, "this isn't just my foundation. It's ours. You've been my partner in everything, and I want you to have just as much ownership in this as I do." Akua blinked in surprise, her lips parting slightly. "Kofi, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Kofi said simply. "Say you'll be by my side, not just for this, but for whatever comes next." Tears welled in Akua's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "always." Their partnership wasn't just professional anymore. It had grown into something deeper, something unshakable. As they stood together on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Kofi felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had tried to break him, but with Akua by his side, he was whole again. The soft murmur of guests filled the countryside house, blending with the sound of birds chirping in the late afternoon. The house had been transformed for the day, decorated with delicate floral arrangements and crisp white linens that adorned the tables set up in the garden. Kofi adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit as he looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time in months, he stood unassisted, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table for balance. "You look incredible," Akua said, stepping into the room. She wore a soft peach dress that hugged her figure modestly, her hair styled elegantly. Her voice carried pride and her eyes shone with warmth. Kofi turned to her, his lips curling into a smile. "So do you," he said, his voice soft. "I still can't believe we're here." Akua stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You made this happen, Kofi. You chose to rebuild, to fight. And look at you now." The day was special. It marked the official launch of their foundation, aptly named the Rising Hope Initiative. Guests ranged from close family and friends to members of the community who had come to support the cause. Kofi and Akua had spent weeks planning the event, their shared vision coming to life in ways neither of them could have imagined. As Kofi made his way to the garden, his parents approached, their faces glowing with pride. His father clapped a hand on his shoulder, careful not to unbalance him. "You've done well, my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother and I couldn't be prouder." "Thank you," Kofi replied, his voice steady. "I wouldn't have made it here without your support and without Akua." His mother turned to Akua, taking her hands in hers. "You are a blessing to this family," she said. "Thank you for standing by him." Akua smiled, her humility evident. "It's been an honor," she said simply. As the event unfolded, Kofi mingled with the guests, his newfound confidence evident in the way he carried himself. Though he still relied on a cane for longer distances, his presence was commanding, a reminder of the man he had always been. Midway through the evening, as Kofi addressed the crowd, Linda appeared. She stood at the edge of the garden, dressed in an understated black dress, her expression unreadable. Kofi noticed her immediately, his words faltering for the briefest moments before he regained his composure. Linda approached slowly, weaving through the guests until she stood before him. The crowd grew quiet, the tension palpable. "Kofi," she said, her voice soft but shaky. "Can we talk?" Kofi studied her for a moment before gesturing to a quieter corner of the garden. They walked, him steady with his cane, her tentative in her movements. When they stopped, Linda turned to him, her eyes glistening. "I've lost everything," she said, her voice breaking. "Daniel, he lied to me. He had a wife, a family, and now I have nothing. No money, no reputation, nothing." She paused, searching his face for a flicker of pity. "I made a mistake, Kofi. I was wrong. But I know we can fix this. We can start over." Kofi's jaw tightened as he listened. The man he had been months ago might have considered her words, clung to the possibility of restoring what they had once shared. But now, standing before her, he felt nothing but resolve. "Linda," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've already started over. Without you." Her eyes widened, the weight of his words sinking in. "You can't mean that," she said, her voice trembling. "After everything we've been through." "What we've been through," Kofi interrupted, "is exactly why this can't happen. You broke my trust, Linda. You broke me. And while I've spent the past months rebuilding myself, you've continued to destroy everything in your path. Us, it's over." Tears spilled down Linda's cheeks as she realized the finality of his words. She turned without another word, disappearing into the crowd. Kofi stood still for a moment, breathing deeply before returning to the event. As he approached Akua, she turned to him, concern etched on her face. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Kofi nodded, a smile breaking across his face. "It is now," he said. "I've closed that chapter for good." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kofi and Akua stood together beneath a canopy of string lights. The glow illuminated their faces, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. Kofi took Akua's hand in his voice steady as he spoke. "You've been my strength, my light, and my partner in every sense of the word. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you. Always." Akua's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Always," she whispered. A few months later, Kofi and Akua exchanged vows in an intimate ceremony at the same countryside house that had become their haven. Their love was quiet but profound, built on a foundation of resilience and shared purpose. Together, they expanded the Rising Hope Initiative, touching countless lives and proving that out of pain and betrayal could come healing and hope. As they stood side by side, watching the sunset from their porch, Kofi reached for Akua's hand, his heart full. This was the new life he had fought for, and it was everything he had ever dreamed of.